It is the eve of the 45th anniversary of the murder of Black consciousness founder Steve Biko. In remembering the events around his passing, Professor Saths Cooper recalls that no policeman, medical practitioner, prison officer or former apartheid politician was held liable for what became an international outcry, despite the post-mortem photographs and pathology reports clearly showing gruesome evidence of torture and terminal brain damage. Professor Cooper, who is the president of the Pan-African Psychology Union and a former leader of the Black Consciousness Movement, as well as a political prisoner and member of the 1970s group of activists, joins me now. Prof, good evening to you and welcome. The TRC, and you raised that again in the op-ed that you wrote, recommended that the murder be investigated. Decades have passed now. What is your view on the fact that no one has been personally held accountable?
I think it is the fault of government that the TRC reports were handed over to President Mandela, and subsequent governments have done little to prosecute. Indeed, I know that some of the attempts to reopen inquests were actually frowned upon and discouraged by people in power. Thankfully, now we have a new Minister of Justice, and he has committed to doing what the courts have asked, actually. So in the cases of other persons like Ahmed Timor and so on, the judges there actually pointed to the reopening of other inquests because of the overwhelming evidence that very few of those who died or were killed, more correctly, killed in detention, committed suicide, or the kinds of excuses that they gave, slipped on a bar of soap and so on. So I think that it is time that we actually knew, the country knew, because we're going through probably the worst period in our psychosocial experience as South Africans in a democracy, and we need to put to bed some of these issues. Unless the ghosts of the past are dealt with, we won't be able to have a happy present and future.
As long as there isn't closure, a lot of questions will remain, and particularly the pursuit of justice will be, a scepter that kind of looms large over our future, as you say. Biko was feared by the apartheid state for his ideas, and his death, together with other concurrent events, political events in South Africa at that time, change the political landscape of our country. And I want you to reflect for our viewers the potency of both his persona and his ideology.
Well, it's important to also recognize that when the state acted under Vervoet against the ANC and PAC directly after the events at Sharpeville and Orlando and other places in the country on the 21st of March 1960, the following month banning the ANC and PAC. There's no vacuum in reality, but there was a vacuum politically, during which period they attempted to enforce Bantustanism. And there arose Steve Biko as a student. He was a medical student who pushed for some political activity. So in the late 60s, he and a few others began to mobilize themselves, very importantly, and mobilize fellow university students. So this was an intellectual movement. It was founded by Steve Biko. He was the first president of the South African Students' Organization, followed immediately by Bani Pichana. So all of us were students at that time in the late 60s, and we could not but be involved in our own path to freedom. And Steve Biko led the quest. It was a dangerous quest because many people, particularly those in exile, those who were banned inside the country, said, you shouldn't be doing this. And we felt it was something we had to do. It wasn't an option. We had to do this.
Well, take us to the tenets of Black consciousness, because we are remembering, and commemoration serves more than just, washing someone's tombstone or washing the figurative tombstone in their honor and in their memory. It is about reanimating some of their beliefs and how it would have currency in contemporary times. So for people who are not familiar with Black consciousness and its objectives, share that with us.
It was about those who did not have the vote. persons who were not voting in the elections that the apartheid regime had, the general elections. That means all those who were not white. But importantly, it also had the principle that you had to identify in solidarity with each other and the struggle. So the definition of black was a socio-economic commitment rather than skin color. And we regarded ourselves as black, as we still do. The Constitution actually does so. The previous Constitution was explicit, the current one not so. But all of us, those who were described in various forms as native, Bantu, plural, colored, Indian, etc., identified as black. This was what Mandela called in 2002 the felt fire that swept this country.
I want to go to this oft-quoted, Biko statement that the strongest weapon in the hands of the oppressor is the minds of the oppressed. But what special meaning does it have now in a liberated South Africa?
Well, our minds are not liberated, Iman. We are caught up in colonial thinking. We are caught up in a negative understandings of ourselves. We have now resurrected the term non-white. Why on the southern tip of Africa should we be doing that? We should be calling ourselves African. We are African, but also none who are ethnic African, and I'm going to use the word ethnic deliberately, say about others, you are a non-African. So why should there be that which we have fought from the colonial conquest from 1652 and finally apartheid from the late 1940s, intended to subjugate those who are not white. And now we resurrect non-white. That cannot be a positive affirmation. And indeed, people in power, the narratives, journalists use that. They would like to separate us further. While the Bantustans failed, democracy has reinstituted narrow ethnicity. Perhaps we face the worst scourge of narrow ethnicity right now, because people look at each other and say, well, Ramaphosa is an X, Zuma was a Y, and that kind of thing. Instead of looking at the person as a national of the country and identifying with the country, not a color, not a language, not an ethnicity or religion.
I wonder if it's not got something to do with this pervasive trend in society to outsource people's views, that original thinking is, in the minority in a sense. Critical thinking is limited. People often attach themselves to the dominant narrative or the thinking of the, quote, mob, especially on places like social media, where it becomes explosive and it builds and gains momentum.
Yes.
How do we get back to a place where people start to think for themselves?
Well, it's interesting you've put it that way, because indeed there are only two homegrown ideologies that this country has confronted in all its history. And more recently, it's been apartheid and its antithesis, which was black consciousness. So using a dialectical argument, Steve Biko said that we needed a solidarity to oppose that minority white racist thinking and occupation of the land and the economic might of this country, which still prevails. And it's sad that 28 years after democracy, after the formal demise of apartheid, the apartheid of the mind is still there. We still look at ourselves in inferior ways, and intellectuals are very few and far between. While our universities produce huge numbers of postgraduates and graduates, there's a laziness to explore issues. The critical insights into what we confront has brought us to this chaotic, miasmic past where we've splintered into so many factions.
People will take exception at the use of the word lazy because, it's got all of these different connotations in South Africa and it's been used in particular contexts. What makes you say that?
Well, because we don't look beyond the veneer. We don't dig deeper. Right now, almost everything is discoverable. You just mentioned social media, and we've been caught up in social media, particularly during the pandemic. But online, you can get invaluable information, not the bot information that trends, that somebody repeats and you get algorithms pushing out particular narratives, but that which we need to know about our history and our immediate history. What were the compacts that were reached at Codesa? It's beginning to come out in dribs and drabs. What are the kinds of things that led to the murderous situation we confront, where councillors, our local councillors, and you had an interview earlier with an official of Salga, they are an endangered species because they can get killed. For merely standing up to represent their constituency, they can get killed. Like police can get killed, like journalists, like frontline responders can get killed in this country. So the shades of the opposition to apartheid that we saw in the mid-80s and growing are returning now amongst us. And that's something that should make us very worried, because the statistics tell us we are the most violent society on earth without a war. We are the least employed society. We have the largest gap in terms of wealth
Equality.
and poverty and so on. All the bad statistics. And yet, this country is rich. On the continent, it's the second richest in terms of mineral wealth after the DRC. And who owns it? It's an extractive economy. The old colonialists have found new fronts, maybe a Cooper and another like that, to take over the reins. And no more are those sheer black-white differences prevalent, but it's how I articulate his master's voice.
A lot of thought-provoking sentiments you've expressed there, things for us to pursue and to continue the conversation on. Prof, thank you for your time and your insights this evening. We appreciate it. Professor Saths Cooper talking to us on the eve of Steve Biko's passing.